Always a very rough transition. Thanks for bearing with us. My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of Film at Museum and the Moving Image, and I welcome you to this week's Reverse Shot Happy Hour. Today is Wednesday, September 9th, as we are several weeks into our transition into Wednesday happy hours. Thanks for getting this far into, thanks for joining us halfway through the week, and congratulations on getting through Hump Day. And wanted to just make a couple notes regarding Museum of the Moving Image. First is thank you for joining us at the happy hour. Thank you for continuing to support us during these months as we transition into online programming as well as our work in the drive-ins. If you are thinking about helping us, supporting us during this time, note that throughout the month of September, we have somebody who's matching all donations. So anything that you donate to the museum will be matched, so it will be doubled. So this is a good time to support any of these programs that you'd like, become a member, etc. We really appreciate it. And in terms of the drive-in, the Queens Drive-In, our partnership with New York Hall of Science and Rooftop Films, that continues apace this weekend, starting tonight with our free screening of All In, and over the next several days with Jurassic Park, double feature of Stray and Bulletproof, two recent documentaries, and then a double feature of The Thing and Videodrome, and on Sunday, classic presentation of The Wizard of Oz with a couple Chuck Jones short films. Thanks for bearing with us. Thank you for bearing with me. And without further ado, I'd love to bring out the hosts of the Reverse Shot Happy Hour, our dear friends, the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Jeff Reichert and Michael Koreski.
Thank you, Eric. Don't you wish that could just happen so much smoother? Can't they do something about that with Zoom, that we just appear?
If I had any experience singing and playing guitar at the same time, maybe I would be able to invite you while finishing up my comments, but I'm way too self-conscious to do that. I'm sorry.
It's coming, trust me. I'm going to do music at some point, but I'm not going to promote it or let people know when it happens. I'm sitting in front of a piano in case anyone is ever wondering what this setup is. But it probably would sound terrible over Zoom.
I think we'd still like it.
I think we still like it.
One day, maybe soon.
See you guys soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Eric, we should say no Fariha today. Our usual compatriot. It is her birthday today, so she's taking the day off. So if you happen to see her on social media, wish her a happy birthday. I won't say how old she is, but she's out there celebrating somewhere.
She's incredibly young. She let us know last night, and everyone always bemoans getting older, but then they say their age and it's always younger than your age, so it makes you feel old. And that's exactly what happened. Yes, Fariha Zaman, our amazing third co-host, who's been here from the beginning every week diligently with us, entertaining all of you out there, is taking this week off, and we miss her. I miss her already.
I mean, I barely recognize you with that haircut.
I thought you said you weren't going to say anything.
Of course I was going to say something. You haven't had a haircut in 8 months or 6 months or however long it's been. It looks fabulous.
Yes. Thank you. For all the people who've been charting the growth of my hair over the past few months. It was the first time anyone touched my hair since the beginning of March. So I'm feeling lighter. And that's as far as I'm gonna go with the haircut conversation.
Yeah, we don't need to take it too much. I'm considering a haircut sometime soon. We'll see what happens.
So for this week, I think we're going to bring our guests out soon, so we're not going to get too much into it. But a lot of the time over the course of this pandemic, I think people have been talking about what movies they've been watching for comfort. Comfort movies, it's a thing. It's like comfort food. It's what you do to kind of make your way through a difficult and trying time. Even when things aren't as bad as they've been, we all need comfort movies. We all have our comfort movies, and I certainly have movies that I return to again and again. But I think we're realizing that a lot of the times those comfort movies aren't necessarily happy movies, and it's actually sort of worth investigating or inquiring why we continue to return to these darker films with these darker themes. And one of the things that instigated this conversation this week was the release of Charlie Kaufman's new movie, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, on Netflix, which we are going to talk about a little today, which I know, and again, when our guests come out, we'll talk about it more in depth with them, but I know you also watched it, Jeff.
Yes.
We had slightly different reaction?
Yeah, I was fairly not excited by it, but we can talk about it more with the gang once they come on.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have, before getting into them too much detail, do you have a bunch of go-to anti-comfort movies? Because I don't mean this as any kind of criticism or judgment on you, because I would never do that to you. We tend to agree on almost everything. But you seem like the sort who doesn't have a lot of comfort movies. No offense.
What do you mean by that?
I can't think of you like going back to Singing in the Rain over and over again just to get a little smile. Obviously, you love Singing in the Rain. I mean, I assume you love Singing in the Rain. I love Singing in the Rain. But I don't hear you talking about like your favorite, smile films.
No, it's true. It's funny. This was a bit of a challenge because I don't know that I necessarily relate to my movie watching in that same way where I have that kind of outlet. So I do have a list of films that, I liked returning to, and I returned to in quarantine because they were available and gave me pleasure, but also really dark. But I tend to turn more towards like bad music, like bad late REM albums.
Well, I know that we've had our moments.
Or like the last week I've been listening to like 80s Beach Boys records, which are not good by any real objective standards. The 70s stuff is better, but it's like that's sort of where I go to when I want to have this weird feeling of like, this is, I don't know what I feel about this. It's comforting. I don't know that I really like it, but it is something. It's giving me a certain kind of feeling.
Yeah, and I've been obviously also trying to make my list of things that I have, both that I've been watching during this strange period, but also just generally movies that I return to. And I realize that it's not just now. It's not that I'm just wallowing in what's going on, but like I have often gone back again and again to films with really dark themes, some of which are so incredible, like appallingly dark, that it makes me wonder why I'm watching them at all. And I don't think it's just a matter of melodrama. Like we can talk about why we go back to melodrama, why I've seen Imitation of Life so many times, or All That Heaven Allows is a fairly happy ending. But generally, like, grim, sad, tragic melodramas, I get that there's like the impulse to want to feel something, but this is something a little different, I think. It's certainly sparked by the Kaufman film, but we shouldn't get too far into it before we bring out our guests. And we're very excited to have them here. They have both appeared on the Reverse Shot Happy Hour before. They have both written for Reverse Shot many times. They are both illustrious people in the film world. I never know what to call this. It's not really an industry. It's kind of a field. What is this? What do we do?
It's this hobby that we have.
Hobby. Yes, that some of us have taken beyond hobby. But we're going to bring them both on together and get this conversation going. First, we have Ashley Clark and Susanna Gruder, who appeared first. See, it's this technology. Ashley Clark, let's see if I can get this right. Director of Programming, Film, correct? At BAM. I got it right. And Susanna Gruder, who has been writing for many outlets, including Reverse Shot, for a number of years now. And we're very happy to have both of you here. So welcome.
Hi.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Welcome. Your mics are working. It's amazing. What were you saying, Jeff?
I was just saying welcome.
Oh, I thought he had something more amazing to say. Okay, so let's just kind of hit the ground running with, I'm going to say the title. I'm thinking of Ending Things, which is the new Charlie Kaufman film. Have we all seen it at this point? We've all watched it. It's very easy to see movies now, right?
Yeah.
Movie that is press a button. Netflix. I sound like such a grandpa. You just press a button. What did you think of it, Ash? And also, we were talking recently about your first experience watching Charlie Kaufman's 2009 film Synecdoche, New York, which I also want to get into. And I wonder how your experience of seeing that for the first time played into this movie. It's a really interesting movie.
Yeah. This was light relief compared to Synecdoche, New York, which I found an extremely difficult film to get through. I think it, in some way, in a similar way with A Serious Man, maybe, by the Coen brothers, or Inside Llewyn Davis, films that are specifically about failure. Taken from one perspective, they're not especially profound, in that they make the case that we are all doomed to failure. It's our fuck-ups that define us, and we're all completely screwed. But I think that they go there in very committed and very tactile and emotionally raw ways. And I was very affected by Synecdoche, watching it for the first time, inseparable from the context with which we're watching it. You know, you mentioned a moment ago our industry or our hobby. That's one thing that we're all constantly thinking about. What's happened to all of our work lives in the past few months within the much bigger issue of public health and the uprisings. It's been the onion has had many layers. So I've been trying to be careful about what I watch, what I subject myself to, because there's a lot to process every day at different speeds. And I wasn't quite prepared for how much that would affect me. So I was slightly trepidatious coming to the new one. And I had a slightly mixed reaction to it in that watching it, I felt that perhaps some of it was slightly warmed over thematically. That there was some of the tricks and leaps that felt like I expected them. But what did surprise me was how much I thought about it afterwards, and how much the film actually strayed into kind of more Lynchian stylistic territory, particularly with the Americana, the 50s diner or ice cream parlor sequence, which was visually very striking and very Lynch-esque Americana. And it strayed more into kind of horror territory in certain places that surprised me. And I did get to thinking about it a lot more over the weekend. I'm not sure how productive my thoughts were. I was trying to, I was going through, speaking of Lynch, it reminded me of my reaction after Mulholland Drive. The first part was to try and piece together the narrative and then ask myself, once I'd figured out the narrative, what left was there? And I think after I had pieced together what I perceived to be the narrative, I was left with, fairly familiar thematic territory that Kaufman has plumbed before. I was a big fan of David Thewlis in the film. And Toni Collette. I thought those sequences that sequence in the house was especially engaging. But I thought all the actors were good and engaging and did interesting things with quite limited roles. These are constructs. These are in some ways not fully fleshed characters, but projections from one source. So yeah, I enjoyed it. It didn't blow me away. There's some profound criticism for you. Three popcorns.
Half a balloon, as they say in all that jazz.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm not angry at myself for having watched it, but it didn't move me in a particularly profound way, I would say.
Susanna, I'd like to get your take on it.
Yeah, I am still sitting with it as well, kind of. And I know that there were, lots of like the ending of, I'm thinking of ending things explained or the dance sequence, whatever. And as tempting as those are, I've been trying to resist. And I feel like it's supposed to be a personal interpretation and I'm kind of okay with that. I have been referencing it a lot. Like in the few days since I've seen it, I've referenced it several times just because I think there are certain images that really stayed with me. Like, every time I see a dog, I think of that dog, shaking infinitely. I've been talking about Cassavetes more and, thinking about car rides a lot more. So I think that is what worked for me. It in no way was as powerful as Synecdoche, New York, or other of Kaufman's films for me. But those are really, that's a really potent one. And that's probably on my list of like feel good, feel bads. But I've probably only seen it 2 or 3 times. And I think I need like several years between each viewing. It's a little intense.
That one went straight into Elephant Man territory for me as a film that I will never be able to watch again. I've seen it once. I know what it did to me. I don't need to.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily need to go back to that place. I wouldn't enter that place voluntarily.
It's a pile driver of a film. And I think that's, talking about the new one in relation to that one where, I feel that movie, it feels like it starts from a place of kind of like lived experiences and very specific details before just exploding out into surreal, whatever you want to call it, but some sort of surrealism, metaphor, etc. And I felt that I was kind of missing that in the new film. It felt like everything was off kilter almost from the very beginning. And so I felt like I was not productively destabilized from the very start. So like your hackles are raised from the start. It's like, okay, this is going to get weird. Weird, something strange is going to happen. And I much prefer sort of having a chance to kind of settle in with the movie. And I did feel the Lynchian thing that you talked about too, Ash. But for me, it's like he manages to marshal kind of the iconography that Lynch plumbs, but without any of the menace. And I think that's what's so exciting about when Lynch dips into the 50s, this time of America that is supposed to be so wholesome and clean, etc., and like finds how dark it is and how violent it is, and it never seems to go there in this one. It left me feeling a pretty mixed. I'll give it 2 apples.
2 apples. I mean, it's an interesting conundrum because obviously it's adapted from a book. And that idea of a reveal, you know, I think a potentially comparable moment in Synecdoche, sorry, spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it, but there's a moment of very intense surrealism when Caden, Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, first goes to the house of the character played by Samantha Morton. And her house is just on fire. And you think, okay, that's the kind of film we're in now. But you've been built up to that point, grounding you in a very rooting you in a very recognizable reality of this guy's everyday struggles. Whereas, as you say, Jeff, this film alienates from the first moment. There's a very early double image, which doubles Jake, played by Jesse Plemons, looking out of a window, and is suddenly doubled with the janitor figure. So immediately you are prepped for something not quite right here. But because they're such, maybe I think of Shani Enelal's piece about the Great Recession. This is in terms of actors doing more and more overtly internalized acting. Jesse Plemons is, you know, perhaps the ultimate example of that. And it's not a particularly expressive film in some ways. So there's a immediate alienation combined with a very recessive interior performance style, which just creates this barrier, which in some ways is by design, right? But I'm kind of into the good old-fashioned emotional engagement sometimes, and looking for that emotional payoff. But yeah, it didn't quite strike me to that extent. And the other thing I would say about Synecdoche is watching Philip Seymour Hoffman is never an easy experience for me after his loss, which is what, 6 years now, I think, maybe 6, 7 years. It never seems to get any easier. And when you watch his performances back, you're reminded anew of how much empathy and sensitivity he brings to characters that otherwise would, or incarnated by other actors, would be almost unbearable. And you realize what just the depth, the talent that was lost with him. And I found that very difficult about Synecdoche. It wasn't comforting. And I'm straying off topic, but.
That's interesting what you're saying about it being hard to relate to his character, because apparently in the book it's like more about the male character, about Jake, I've heard. But I was talking to someone about it who happened to be a guy, and he was like, yeah, like Jake was the protagonist, you know? And I was like, no, the female was the protagonist. It was completely her film, you know? And I don't know, I think that, I mean, I didn't realize that was up for interpretation, but apparently it was. And I think that was, I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if you just don't relate to either character fully, or you can relate to either one depending on where you're standing, but I thought
it seems to be a semi-pivot, because one of the very understandable and I think justified criticisms of Kaufman's work is that these are intensely, you said pile driver, Jeff, like pile drivingly solipsistic works about men, masculinity, and creative failure. This is at least some attempt. I mean, obviously we have Eternal Sunshine and Being John Malkovich are exceptions in terms of the complex women characters. We have an attempt here after Anomalisa and Synecdoche, but she's still by design a projection. And so you're in that slightly unmoored space of a character, a woman character's inner thoughts constructed by a man, or constructed entirely by someone else, which is it's fascinating from a a literary or perspective sense. But again, I'm like a broken record. But thinking about how we relate, and I found that kind of slightly missing.
I mean, it feels self-consciously designed that way. I mean, obviously everything's incredibly self-conscious about his films. There's no room for spontaneity. There's not, even though I guess I find one of the big contradictions of his films is that they're supposedly open to interpretation. They're actually not. They're very hermetic. They're very closed. Once you kind of get in on the idea or the concept, there's not really much else. There's nowhere you can really go with it. And I find that I can find that to be alienating or unintentionally alienating. It tries to be alienating. In some filmmakers, but with him, I don't know what it is. I find that there's a power to, like what Susanna was saying, there's a power to the image making, and there's a power to like the central metaphors that just works for me. So I actually really liked it quite a bit, I think, more than I expected to. When I say I'm not sold on the last half hour or whatever, I don't mean that to be complete judgment on the film, because I think I will watch this movie again. I think I will think more about this movie. It's just marinating in my head right now. I just was so taken with the scenes that he sets up and the sense of being trapped within a mind, within a head, and within those spaces. So like the scenes in the house are just beautifully done and very moving, I thought, and almost reached synecdoche levels of pathos. I would say that if it had stayed in the house, maybe it would have even got to that level. The claustrophobia, I thought at one point, wow, this movie is so productively claustrophobic, it's going to be like a masterpiece, but it didn't stay there. But I also really loved the scenes in the car surrounded by the snow. I had a slight feeling, and the reason that I'm not willing to kind of go all the way yet on it with a judgment on the film is because I had a similar response, and this movie comes up a lot during this happy hour, to the way I felt about AI the first time I saw it. I'm not in any way saying that I think this movie is at the level of that film, which is obviously a masterpiece. But when I first saw AI, I did have the usual response, which is that, oh, if it had ended in the bottom of the ocean, in the amphibicopter, where he's, David the robot boy is face to face with the blue fairy, asking, to be made real for eternity, and he's just trapped there forever. And it seems like the movie ends, and then of course there's a whole other ending. I had a similar feeling in this movie when she's trapped in the car with the snow falling. It actually gets really frightening. I think this is when the movie gets scariest. And at that point, even though maybe we realized she might be a projection or a double or something, I was still feeling what she was feeling. I felt like she was a real character. I think there's something similar going on with the two films. And I think that maybe the more I see it, the more I'll come to appreciate and understand what happens after that. But I did feel like, oh, if this movie ended here, if this were the end of this movie, just in that car with the snow falling everywhere, and I'm talking around it because I don't want to completely spoil it for people, I thought, oh, this could be a masterpiece. But I'm not saying it isn't, and I'm not saying anything because I want to keep watching it. But it did have a similar feeling, and I think that Kaufman is a surprisingly adept filmmaker, a maker of images, actually, considering that for so long we just thought of him as a screenwriter. And Synecdoche, New York, not to go on about this forever because we have so many other things we want to talk about, but Synecdoche, New York, I had such a strong emotional reaction to when I first saw it. And I had mentioned this to you a little bit, Ash, when we were talking. Like, I went to see it with my husband when it came out, and it was a very hard year emotionally for me, just for family reasons. And I saw it at just kind of the wrong moment. When that movie ended, I was on the sidewalk, and I had a breakdown, basically. I just couldn't stop crying. It was a very intense emotional reaction to something that felt really existential. So I can't deny that, and I can't deny that Charlie Kaufman is doing something that really gets to me and rattles me, and I'm going to keep on revisiting it. But I actually haven't seen Synecdoche since then, just like you're both saying. I cannot revisit it. It's too strong. There's just too much there.
I've only seen it one more time since, and I don't think I could ever watch Inside Llewyn Davis again.
I've seen that many times. I love it so much. There's a similar thing emotionally that movie does, too. The scene in the scenes in the car on the way back from Chicago, wow. I mean, I just get the chill. I literally just got a chill. I got a chill went up my spine.
I saw that at the Lincoln Plaza Cinemas, RIP, when it came out, and we came out into the snow, and it was just perfect. But I was in a daze for a good 30 minutes after watching it. And speaking of cinemas, you know, we're all collectively watching the new Kaufman film on Netflix, and kudos to them for getting behind it, and I'm glad that we got to see it in some form. But I couldn't help also thinking what it would be like to go and see this film on opening weekend.
Yeah.
Michael, you spoke about Kaufman's filmmaking skills. He's often primarily thought of as a writer, but he's clearly developing, or has developed, you know, a very significant and robust filmmaking style as well. And those films the scenes in the car are extremely atmospheric. And I was kind of dying I was imagining what it would be like to see that on the big screen. So hopefully one day we will be able to kind of see it and get the full impact of it.
Now, there's a series idea for some enterprising programmer. Movies that came out during the pandemic that were only on the small screen, you can finally see on the big screen.
Tiger King, finally.
So just to move on from this, since we're kind of reaching our midpoint, we want to get back to the central theme of these kind of feel good movies, of which I'm thinking of ending things could eventually be if we continue to revisit it. So Susanna, I'm curious to ask you if you'd like to talk about one of your choices. I'm just delighted and horrified by some of them, so take it away.
Yeah, so happy to air these, you know, ruminations about my weird issues with strange movies publicly. Yeah, no, I mean, I was sort of looking through, I have like lists of some of my favorite movies like in my head and on Letterboxd and stuff, and it's like kind of hard to find one that is like just flat out feel good. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to think about why that is, and I don't know, I guess I'm just like more excited by a film that kind of just like stares into the void and like says there's no rules in the universe, there's no inherent goodness, and then getting catharsis from that is kind of just like so much more earned than getting catharsis from like a happy ending for me. So, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is The Piano Teacher, which I guess is kind of fitting because it's about someone who is kind of masochistic, and it's like, you know, someone's like, oh, let's watch one of your favorite movies. I'm not going to suggest that one. That's like something that you watch alone, and like that's something that you sit with alone, and I think you relate to on a deeper level. I mean, the movie itself is perfect to me, start to finish.
For those who haven't seen it, maybe give it a little back. This is the Michael Haneke film you're talking about, correct?
Yeah. Michael Haneke, Isabelle Huppert stars as a piano teacher who kind of finds herself in a relationship with a very kind of intense student who is much younger than her, I think, and she also has a very domineering mother, and it's kind of about her strange issues with, she sort of just conflates love and violence in a lot of ways, and it has one of the most intense endings of any film I've ever seen. And knowing that and watching it again is kind of just like even more feel good. It's even more thrilling. It makes me enjoy it even more because I'm like feeling it the whole time. I'm holding my breath the whole time, waiting for it. And it's her performance, and it's the mood. It's the strange, like early 2000s, like Austrian, but they're speaking French mood. And the script is perfect too, and the direction, but it's really just about, it's totally about her performance for me.
We had a comment just now that Brian watched The Piano Teacher with his wife and mother-in-law.
No, that's just not advisable.
Did you think it was Mr. Holland's opus? It's too late, I'm afraid.
The
It's a nice
title is-
movie about a piano teacher.
You know, it's funny you bring that movie up. I have like kind of a complicated relationship with Michael Haneke. I'm not really on board most of the time, especially with some of his most acclaimed films. Actually, I find them to be kind of, willfully antagonistic in ways that aren't always particularly layered or interesting to me. And beyond that, issues beyond that, the way he kind of toys with the viewer in very overt ways, I've found not off-putting because that's what he wants, but just kind of like childish. However, I actually really like The Piano Teacher, and it's so strange because that movie, and I also saw it a lot. I remember seeing it completely by myself at the Quad Cinema years ago, and feeling like I should be watching this alone at the Quad Cinema. You know what I mean? Like, kind of felt like an illicit place to watch something. And I remember thinking it was incredibly entertaining. I know that's a strange thing to say, but and I haven't seen it since, so I can't really talk about why or how, but I remember it just moving from scene to scene so fluidly, and I was so into it every moment. There wasn't a moment where I wasn't out of it. And I thought, well, he's an entertainer. He's like a sick, great entertainer.
No, maybe his best movie is Time of the Wolf, which is...
It's not that entertaining.
Like, what are you talking about? It's so entertaining. That movie cranks from start to finish. I mean, I won't say that it's necessarily great, but man, it flies by.
I mean, you could argue that like Funny Games is really entertaining, but that's just like a feel bad, like no redeeming qualities for me kind of movie. But yeah, you're right, Michael. Like I watched it at the beginning of quarantine, brilliantly, and it was like the perfect. I wasn't thinking about anything else. It had me like completely wrapped up in it, and yeah, it kind of is like it really does move.
I think the last Haneke film I saw was his most recent one called Happy End, which was actually the first film I saw at that year's Toronto Film Festival.
I saw it in Toronto as
It was
well.
a few years ago, and I remember not thinking a great deal of it, but it grew on me as the days progressed, and that the standard of everything else that I saw was really varying. And it just, sometimes festival viewing is handy when it's that intense kind of volume of viewing is handy to remind you who's actually pretty masterful in terms of their technique and style. And I don't take that for granted. I haven't always got on with his work for what it's worth, but I would say I think Cachet or Hidden is up there with one of my favorites, and Code Unknown I think is great as well.
Those are the best. I agree.
Yeah.
So what's? Oh, sorry. I was going to say what's one of your films, but if you wanted to keep talking about,
I do recommend. There's an incredible clip that was going viral last week. It's from years and years ago, but it's like one of them Hollywood Reporter roundtables from the Oscars years ago, and
I saw it.
it's the kind of open for a surprise kind of thing. Like if you can find it, Jeff.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it.
I won't spoil it, but it's incredibly funny.
I sent it to Michael a few days ago.
I was confused by it, to tell you the truth, but
well, it's really confusing. It needs further context, but it's very funny. It's probably funnier than anything he's ever done in any of his movies.
Well, it's funny because have you seen this, Susanna? Do you know what we're talking about? Have you seen this? I won't spoil who else is in it, but all I can say is that it has one of my very least favorite filmmakers in it.
It's a Hollywood Reporter roundtable with Michael Haneke.
Yeah,
it's one. I want to leave it for a treat for the viewers after this.
Yeah.
It's incredibly funny. The less you know going in, the better. But in response to your prompt, guys, about comfort and not necessarily upbeat films, I think I was thinking a lot about the question of home, and what home means, and what I've obviously moved to the States 6 years ago, so something that I often go to are British films that remind me of certain rhythms of life back home and perspectives. And I think this is generalization, but what people find comforting in Britain is very different. We have a long tradition of extraordinarily depressing soap operas. Like there's one called EastEnders, which was launched in 1985, and it's set in the fictional East London district of Walford. And it's just it's broadcast 3 or 4 times a week, and it's just a litany of alcoholism, divorces, beatings, car accidents, nervous breakdowns, suicides. And I remember in 2017 going home for Christmas, and my wife, who's American, came over with me, and we all sat down in front of the television to watch the EastEnders Christmas special. And I think my wife was expecting something like, you know, some togetherness, something upbeat, home for the holidays. And it culminated with a suicidal alcoholic father going up to the roof of his house to jump off, his 2 daughters going up to attempt to save him, but they actually fell off and died themselves. And then it ended. And my wife looked at me and said, and you guys find this, you know, appropriate comfort view? And I think part of it is to do with this idea in Britain, again, huge generalizations, but our soap operas, our entertainment is less aspirational. There's certainly a certain know your place element of culture in Britain. And part of the fun, I think, is saying, an aspect of Schadenfreude, saying, well, our lives aren't great, but at least we're not these poor fuckers, basically. And that is a long-winded entree into speaking about the films of Mike Leigh, who is an absolute go-to for comfort. And I think it completely fits the description of films that are in no way classically uplifting. Even something like Happy Go Lucky has an incredible melancholic, was it the Jake Gyllenhaal clip? Sorry, I can't remember. It's some clip. He was like melancholy, and Jake Gyllenhaal is like melancholy. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. Yeah, it's very funny. You know, even Happy Go Lucky has an extremely melancholic undertow, with the kind of psychotic Eddie Marsan character and their antagonistic relationship, which seems to be like a holdover from a relationship between Sally Hawkins and a young, very troubled man in the film All or Nothing from a few years previous. So something that's really joyful for me from a creative perspective is watching Mike Leigh fine-tune these relationships and dynamics in his films, which all share this very hermetically sealed, very grim location and milieu, and these characters are sniping at each other, and conversations are very circular. But they really key into an idea of Britishness and how we communicate, how we code language, how we don't say what we mean, and sometimes expect people to understand us, even though we're not coming out and saying things. So these films are by no means uplifting or upbeat, but they are very comforting because they remind me of a set of rhythms and characteristics and tones that are not immediately available to me here. I think films like, what did I write down here? Life is Sweet is another one, which has a more comedic dimension, but it is also extremely tragic. And I think my favorite of all of his films is Meantime, which was a Channel 4 television film, which I saw on a 16mm print at the MoMA earlier this year. It was an incredible experience to go and see Meantime, an 80s British TV movie in the middle of Manhattan on a Saturday night with a big full crowd. And I think that's the kind of apex of his family, these kind of a family portrait of people who are never speaking the same language. They spark off each other, they're antagonistic to each other, but there's something bonding them together. And in some cases that is pure enmity. And it's one of his more compassionate films. So I think Mike Leigh is someone that I go to often, having moved here, to remind me of a certain feeling of home. And that's also related to other films that kind of fit that characteristic, like a filmmaker who's much less consistent aesthetically or artistically is Michael Winterbottom. His film Wonderland, I think, is potentially my favorite London film ever. And that is a film about micro tragedies between within a family, people not communicating with each other, but it's the feel for London, a disappearing London. Soho location, which is the same location you see in certain scenes in Naked, which is that illustration behind me. A Soho that used to be vibrant and dangerous and edgy and sinister has now become almost completely gentrified. All the clubs, all the record shops have gone. And Wonderland, which came out at the turn of the century, is a beautiful document of that. But the locations also Selhurst Park, the football stadium where I used to go and watch Wimbledon Football Club, with my granddad growing up. There's a scene with a pretty useless father taking his son to the football at Selhurst Park, and it's just extremely evocative of certain experiences from my own life. And so, yeah, it's, again, long-winded way around this, but I think when I look for comfort, it's absolutely getting a sense of home. And British filmmakers are not especially good. Michael, you're Terence Davis aficionado. They're not very good at doing uplifting things anyway. There's always an undercurrent of tragedy or sarcasm or despair or something.
No.
I find that very comforting.
And I always, found a lot to relate to in that approach to filmmaking and that way of dealing with one's, for lack of a better term, repressed emotions. Of all the Davies films, the Terence Davies films, the one that I like to bring up the most for people who haven't seen, because they tend to be the most shocked by it, is the trilogy, the Terence Davies trilogy, which is a trilogy of 3 short films taken together. They create something like a feature: Children, Madonna and Child, and Death and Transfiguration. I love recommending that to people because it's so unbelievably, unrelentingly grim. I mean, you think of Distant Voices, Still Lives, or The Long Day Closes, if you've seen them, as films that are about, to a certain extent, frozen lives, people overcoming domestic crises, trapped within, certain boundaries in their home. But they are Singing in the Rain compared to the Terence Davies trilogy of these 3 films, which he made to actually, it was like an alternative vision of his own life, his fears for his own life. Sorry, there's a garbage truck going by.
That's Terence coming up to.
He's making them he made them when he was younger. They were the first things he made, and he actually was making films about his own potentially lonely death. And what if he hadn't become a creative person? What if he ended up just working in this really drab office for the rest of his life? And what if he was always closeted and sneaking around late at night in gay bars? And what if he found nobody? And then what if he died alone? I mean, he just followed the trajectory of this surrogate character's life from childhood to death. And it's about as unappealing as a movie that I've ever seen. But again, I've watched it like 20 times. So there's obviously something wrong with me.
It's just extremely emotionally resonant material, right? It's direct in its own way. It also reminds me of another great trilogy, which I'd like to bring up, which is the Bill Douglas trilogy.
Yeah.
A Scottish filmmaker, My Own Folk, My Childhood, and My Way Home, which were three short films. The third one is the longest. I think it's 70 minutes. But these are another high watermark of British cinema. Just amazing work, and a lot more emotionally direct than I think many people are prepared for when they come to watch British cinema. And I think shares some DNA with the Terence Davies movies as well.
Susanna, I was actually curious about another film that you had mentioned, just because I'm interested in the way you characterize it as feel bad, feel good, which was 2001: A Space Odyssey, because it got me thinking about, because it's one of my very, very favorite films, of course. It got me thinking about Kubrick and whether Kubrick counts as feel bad, feel good.
Yeah, I was kind of just thinking through all his movies, and I was like, yep, that works. Like, specifically, like Eyes Wide Shut is so much fun and so depressing. But I just saw it at the Queen's Drive-In. Shout out.
Ah, nice.
Check it out. Which was super cool because you could see the moon while you're watching it. So I highly recommend that. But yeah, so I guess I was remembering it. I've seen it a million times, but I was remembering it as just being like a cool sci-fi movie with amazing effects and like, the how part being terrifying and, being like the scariest movie monster of all time. But I just wasn't prepared for it being so bleak. And I know the ending is up for interpretation, but like it was bleak to me. You know, and I I felt bad for the person I brought. Like I thought it was gonna be like, you know,
A good time.
yeah, a good time. And
As you're in the car, maybe the expectation is that something thrilling will happen.
yeah, no, I mean, and it was great, but it was definitely just like it was dark. And I mean, there's so much death. There's so much like strange violence that isn't even explained. It's sort of just like you have to assume what happens, and that's even worse for me than just seeing it. Like
Yeah, and one of the most shocking movie deaths of all time, which is the deaths of the three men in hypersleep. You just see the line go flat.
it's devastating. I completely forgot about how devastating that was. And it's so silent and cold and doesn't really give you a chance to even really process it. It's like, you know, I think there's bittersweet movies, you know, which is like a dime a dozen. And then there's just like mean movies, which like, you know, like Naked, Mike Lee is just like mean. And I'm like, yeah, you know, but like this was mean and
So interesting.
hopeless. And
Oh, that's so interesting. To call 2001: A Space Odyssey hopeless is so interesting because it's I would never have said that, but hearing you say it, it doesn't sound wrong. It's just it's a Rorschach movie, right? It's what you take from it.
right. Yeah. I mean, the ending was amazing. Like all the cars like honk the Blue Danube in unison. It was like
Oh.
so adorable. And the most like community I felt in months. But like overall, I was just like, I couldn't sleep that night. I was like very upset. So, but it, you know, 10 out of 10.
That reminds that's a good future episode theme. Movies that made you lose.
Yeah.
Oh, 29 Palms.
29 Palms, which we saw together. Story for another time.
Yeah.
Very upsetting film. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
So you see 29 Palms.
Bit ominous.
I feel like when 29 Palms is referenced, I have to just somehow appear for no reason.
I wish your head was shaved with a knife.
All right, enough of that. I wanted to say before something that I was thinking of, because in response a little bit to Ash's point about you know, the particular national flavor, national character of these films that he's chosen, like, you know, specifically British films that remind him of something that he can relate to from his childhood experience. I was sitting there trying to think of, well, what's the quintessentially American version of that? You know, what's the tendency of this type of a feel bad, feel good film that I would consider distinctly American? I was thinking of The Magnificent Ambersons because it's one of my favorite movies, the Orson Welles movie from 1942. I would prefer to watch it I'm not saying it's better than Citizen Kane. Who cares about that debate? I would prefer to watch it. It's my favorite Welles film. But it's incredibly grim. And I think something specific, so specifically American, the way that movie is about kind of the decline of empire and, you know, the decline of values and expectation and hope and growth all just withering on the vine.
And like 2001 about the menace of technology.
And absolutely about, the encroaching menace of technology. Those, you know, shots of the telephone poles at the end and of course the cars. And, but I go back to that movie again and again. I love watching you know, what did George Emerson Minifer get his, right? I mean, even though it would be kind of foolish to not see yourself in him, right? It's still very satisfying to watch that decline, even though the decline again is like American growth, right? Growth equals death in that movie. So I just want to watch it again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the movies we're talking about here, there's a kind of formal mastery of the medium paired with these narratives of failure, these narratives of eternity, these devastating narratives that, you know, for us movie folk, it can be really exhilarating. I was looking over my list and, you know, things that I think about, like I love watching Red Desert. which is such a fucking bummer, but I love watching Red Desert. Just the other night, I subjected my girlfriend to Alain René's Je t'aime, je t'aime. Which, if you don't really think too hard about the actual narrative of the movie, which is about, a potential murder, a suicide, it is almost kind of like a goofy time travel film where a gentleman is brought to a lab and he sits in kind of like a big device that looks a bit like a pork bun, and he's sort of slingshot through time and revisits all these moments of his past life, like falling in love and being on a trip, and then it just gets gradually and gradually darker. But because Renee is so able to mold and meld the material of the movie, it's exciting and it's fun, even up until the very end when it leads to utter tragedy. So you leave the movie exhilarated. It's great. It's wonderful. What an experience, but it's dark. So dark. Ahazar Balthazar.
Bag. Done, but that's one of the greats.
Mouchette.
Yeah, Mouchette is not entertaining. Mouchette is an amazing film that I just don't want to return to ever again.
It is. There it is.
You can't have a conversation with Ashley without him bringing out the law. So go ahead.
No, I've done it now. But I did want to briefly mention another British film, which I think fits this bill, especially for bringing me some cold comfort, is Withnail and I, which is spoken of mostly as a comedy. The first experience I had of it was awful. Watching it when I was a student, it was the first time I saw it at a cinema in Brighton, and it was like a quota-long screening. So you had like 200 pissed students saying the line just before each of the characters said it, and it was like horrible. But the older I get, the more I watch it, the more just desperate and tragic it becomes. And it is also another great film about failure. And you have the way that the two of them, part ways at the end. You have the one guy who cleans himself up. It potentially comes from more as well, but suppresses that information throughout the film, really. And then you're left with this indelible image of poor old Richard E. Grant in the driving rain. It's a really powerful image. And the older I get, the more I watch it, the less funny and the more pathos I take in it. But it's like a friend, there's so many great lines in it that, I guess that's what the students were responding to. So now I do it on my own with the TV.
I wanted to talk about the idea of endings and why they are so potent in a lot of these cases. Especially because I'm thinking of ending things is like so much about the ending without giving it away. It just kind of reverses a lot of what was going on in this, ostensibly feel bad movie. And I was thinking about a movie like Le Bonheur or Happiness, Agnes Varda, and it's, it's in the title. It's pretty much a feel-good movie all the way through until the last 5 minutes or something. And that's, it completely is devastating. And then does that mean it's a feel-bad movie? Or it's sort of like and I'm thinking of endings, they're fighting against the bad endings so hard that it's almost like it's bound to fail. And I'm curious about that kind of structure.
I mean, Le Bonheur is one of the trickiest movies I think I've ever seen. I've seen it a few times, and every time I think I'm going to kind of crack it, like it's a nut to crack, and I never quite get there. And I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I think that Varda is really testing the audience's capacity for narratives, right? For the capacity for trying to ascertain what's happy, what's sad, what's real, what's not real, and it's so provocative. I mean, it's one of those movies that's so elementally great and conceptually daring that I can't believe that there's only that movie that does that. And I think that's why I would return to it again and again.
Yeah, except for this movie now is I don't know. There's other movies like Minnie and Moskowitz also kind of does the opposite, where it's brutal throughout the entire movie, and then there's this weird fantasy of an ending, and it's also about a relationship that shouldn't really happen, that they're just like fighting for in the same way as the Kaufman and like so many Kaufmans. And it's like, even if the ending is fake, it's like that you just feel kind of like it's necessary to tack on in some cases. And it feels even grosser to me that there's this like weird fake happy ending. It's even more bleak.
Yes. False happy endings are incredibly disturbing. There's nothing more disturbing.
I was
No
thinking,
pressure on wrapping this one, Eric.
well, I was like,
Curious.
no, there's a lot of things because I was thinking about what Ashley was saying in terms of English cinema and storytelling and that kind of gravitation toward dour or upsetting or depressing narratives, and why I actually think that it just makes sense. I think, and it's not the only cinema that does that. I mean, I think about Russian cinema, and that, like, I mean, the most beloved Russian stories of all time are as depressing as you possibly could imagine, and the obsession with World War II, which is, I mean, it's you can't ever reconcile the experience of World War II in Russia, and so there's constant storytelling around it. And some like a film like Letter Never Sent, which is sort of like a thaw film, absolutely beloved film, and it could not be more depressing. Like, it is so immensely upsetting, but it's gorgeous, and you want to revisit it. You want to get into that space, and of course you get to an irreconcilably depressing, upsetting place at the end, but somehow there's some geometry here that when my brain wants to make some geometry out of this, whereas like Ashley, you were saying something to the effect of seeing somebody go through something even worse somehow allows you into it. Like you can enter into that space. You're not looking for somebody to suffer more than you do, but the fact that there's any gap at all creates space for you, you know.
And sometimes there's that delicate dance between empathy and Schadenfreude.
Yeah.
And sometimes the enjoyment comes out of the latter. But
Sure.
a film can't be truly resonant without exhibiting the former. And I
And-
think
and-
Mike Leigh is very good at that.
And enjoyment is a complicated word too, because like you're not necessarily enjoying someone's suffering, but there's an enjoyment in exactly what you're articulating, which not the same thing as smiles and laughter, you know, although some storytellers will lean into that to provoke that. But the other filmmaker that I've been thinking about is Michael Mann, because I thought, Michael, you mentioned something about melodrama, and I've always felt that Michael Mann is in some ways this melodramatist for straight men, and there's something about, I think, why I respond to those films emotionally. Like, I don't respond to Michael Mann for being a cool stylist. I actually respond to him very emotionally. I don't think he's the most sophisticated emotional storyteller, but again, there's something about this, the fact that there's always about disconnection and misidentification and the impossibility that allows me to emotionally get in there. You know, so like a film like Miami Vice, which not everybody loves, and I know Jeff and I do, and Michael, you don't, but there's something about what the space that's created by that film that I find it I found it so incredibly moving, and I don't think it's meant to be super moving.
I'm just for the record, I'm fine with Miami Vice. I don't dislike Miami Vice. I don't want that to get out on film Twitter. However, I will say that I do think I will say that Michael Mann's movies are kind of a version of straight male camp that I don't understand at all. And I'm
He's
not
missing from the Bruce LaBruce list, right?
saying,
People should look that up.
enough skin off my ass than the Insider. I mean, give me a break. I mean, that's like a best movie. So I'm not saying anything to denigrate the films of Michael Mann. I just don't understand them. I'll keep trying.
No, you don't need to. I'm in some ways I'm just articulating why I do. You know, that I think that it's not even necessarily I'm responding to their primary function, but there's something else that storytelling allows for me to get into. And so I think of that when this question with this as a prompt, because they are invariably feel bad films, but I want to feel that particular badness in those films.
Just want to feel something.
Yeah, just want to feel something.
That's what I was going to say at the top of it.
Even the piano teacher, where you want to see somebody just abuse themselves and stab themselves, and yeah, feels good.
I have a question because we have to wrap this up, but I do have a question because I'm interested. I think a lot of the time, the movies we've been talking about are that we enjoy that are also grim, also happen to be aesthetically impressive movies where you can so easily get off on the beauty, the compositions, the framing, the sound, the cinematography. Can we think of any like depressing movies that are actually aesthetically uninteresting? that we also like, where you can't really rely on the aesthetic or form to justify why you would watch it again and again.
Well, is it bad aesthetics or is it uninteresting aesthetics?
I don't mean it has to be bad, less interesting, less overtly stylized. Not talking about Kubrick, not talking about Kaufman, not talking about.
What about documentaries? Like, I would say Wiener, for example, is
Oh,
It's
a feel good, feel bad movie.
What's that feel good about?
okay, there we go. That's good. That's what I get to see him on the subway. I don't even have to watch that movie. I've seen him on the subway so many times. That's interesting, the documentary, only because, because aesthetics aren't necessarily foregrounded, right, in some of these films.
Well, I mean, polished sometimes because it's what's available to the documentarian. But I would, I think stylized aesthetics perhaps rather than aesthetics full stop.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. This, like foregrounded, stylized.
Because you don't want the documentary community and Michael Mann people after you on film Twitter.
I don't want Eric Hines after me.
Yeah, it's true actually.
Or Jeff. You're gonna attack us.
Documentaries.
Oh, Jeff has just cancelled you, Michael, in the chat.
Jeff hates documentaries more than he hates me. Let's be honest.
The longer this gets, the darker things get in Jeff's apartment. It's really scary.
It's really disturbing.
Like, turn a light on or something.
Jeff, can you do the thing that the dog does in I'm thinking of ending things, just as the film ends, just like shake. Maybe.
Should I go like douse myself in water?
Yeah, and it'll come off the beard. You'll just like endlessly shake for the rest of the. Oh no, you don't have to actually.
I think it's time to toast with that.
Well, we should toast to Fariha because it's her birthday.
Happy birthday, Fariha.
Happy birthday, Faria.
Yay.
Happy birthday, Fariha. We missed you. It was a great conversation.
We'll see y'all next week on Wednesday.
See you next Wednesday. Thank you for being here, Ashley and Suzanne. It was great to have this conversation. I hope
Thank
you
you.
enjoyed yourselves.
Want to shout out to Chris Wisniewski, Justin Stewart, and Ryan Swen, and also those of you that have continued to find us over these weeks. I see you and really appreciate your visiting us every week.
We see you.
Thanks for that. We see you.
Thanks for seeing us.
Seen.
Okay, bye everybody.